The dust of Redemption Creek, Montana, settled on everything. A fine golden powder that clung to Caleb's boots and the hem of Ilara's ivory dress. It was a good dust, the kind that spoke of fertile land and long sun-drenched days. It was the dust of their future, the very ground they planned to build a life on. From the porch of the small ranch house he'd inherited, Caleb watched her, a vision of impossible grace against the rugged backdrop of the Absaroka Mountains. Her laughter, carried on the breeze, was a melody that soothed the wild, untamed corners of his soul. Ilara Vance wasn't from this world of hard work and open skies. She had come from the city, a place of steel and glass, and men like Marcus Thorne. She had been engaged to Marcus, a union orchestrated by their families to merge two corporate dynasties. To the outside world, he was a catch. Handsome, impossibly wealthy, dripping with a charisma so polished it was almost blinding. But Ilara knew the man behind the facade. She knew the cold grip of his possessiveness, the subtle threats veiled as jokes, the way his eyes would go flat and hard when she expressed an opinion that didn't align with his. She had lived in a gilded cage, and the bars were closing in. Her escape had been an act of quiet desperation. A trip to visit a college friend that became a one-way ticket to a new life. She found work waitressing at the Rusty Spur, the town's only diner, trading designer heels for comfortable flats and polite empty conversations for genuine connections. It was there she met Caleb. He wasn't like the men she knew. Caleb Blackwood was a man carved from the Montana landscape itself. He was quiet, his words chosen with the care of a man who understood their weight. He had a stillness about him, a deep-rooted confidence that needed no announcement. His hands, calloused and strong from mending fences and calming horses, had been gentle when he'd first taken hers. He had looked at her not as a prize to be owned, but as a horizon to be explored. With him, for the first time, she could breathe. Their courtship was slow and natural, like the turning of the seasons. It was shared sunrises over coffee, long rides through wildflower meadows, and quiet evenings by the fire. He showed her how to read the clouds, how to listen to the language of the horses, how to find strength not in what you owned, but in what you built. He was her sanctuary. But a man like Marcus Thorne did not simply let go. He considered Ilara his property, a beautiful asset that had been stolen. His initial attempts to win her back were laced with his signature arrogance. Lavish gifts sent to the diner, condescending offers to rescue her from her quaint, rustic life. When she refused them all, his tone shifted. The calls became more frequent, his voice a low, menacing purr that made the hair on her arms stand up. "You're making a mistake, Ilara," he'd said in their last conversation, a week before the wedding. "This little cowboy fantasy of yours is amusing, but it's time to come home. You belong with me, you know that." "I belong here, Marcus. With Caleb." A cold silence had followed, so profound she could hear the hum of the phone line. "We'll see about that," he'd whispered, and hung up. The threat hung in the air, an unspoken storm cloud on the horizon of their perfect day. Caleb knew about Marcus, of course. Ilara had told him everything. He had listened, his jaw tight, his knuckles white as he gripped his coffee mug. He hadn't said much, only, "He ever lays a hand on you, Ilara, he'll be pulling it back a stump." Now, on their wedding day, the town had gathered. Friends and neighbors filled the rows of hay bales set up in the pasture behind the barn. The air smelled of alfalfa, pine, and the faint, sweet perfume of Ilara's bouquet. Sadie, her friend from the diner and now her maid of honor, fussed with the veil. "You're shaking," Sadie said, her voice gentle. "Happy nerves," Ilara lied, forcing a smile. But it wasn't just happiness. It was the chilling echo of Marcus's last words. She scanned the crowd, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. He wouldn't. He couldn't be so bold, so monstrous, as to ruin this day. Caleb stood at the makeshift altar, a solid, reassuring presence in his best dark suit. His eyes found hers, and for a moment the fear receded. In his gaze, she saw their future, the children they would raise, the land they would tend, the love that would anchor them through any storm. This was real. Marcus was a ghost from a life she had left behind. He had no power here. She took a deep breath, took her father's arm, and started her walk toward the man who held her heart. The music began, a simple, hopeful melody on a lone guitar, and for a blissful moment, everything was perfect. The weeks leading up to the wedding had been a slow-burning fuse. Marcus Thorne did not believe in defeat. He believed in escalation. He began by testing the waters, trying to find a crack in their foundation. A sleek black car, as out of place as a rattlesnake in a church pew, would be parked on the main street of Redemption Creek for hours. Sometimes Ilara would see him inside, sunglasses on, just watching the diner. He never got out, never approached. He just made his presence known, a predator observing his prey. Caleb felt the pressure in the tightening of his jaw and the long, silent hours he spent staring out at the fence line after dark. One afternoon, a man in a sharp suit, a lawyer from a big city firm, showed up at the ranch. He presented Caleb with a ridiculously high offer for the land, an offer so inflated it was insulting. "Mr. Thorne is a developer with an interest in this region," the lawyer had said smoothly. "He believes this property has potential." Caleb had calmly folded the offer sheet, handed it back, and said, "This property's potential is being realized. It's not for sale." He didn't mention Marcus's name. To do so would be to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. The lawyer had smiled a thin, humorless smile. "Mr. Thorne is a very persistent man." The psychological games intensified. A prize-winning bull Caleb had been planning to sell at the state auction suddenly fell ill. The vet couldn't find a clear cause, but the timing was too coincidental. A vital piece of equipment for their well pump went missing, forcing Caleb to haul water for the livestock for 2 days until a replacement could be flown in. These were small, untraceable acts of sabotage designed to wear him down, to make him seem incapable of providing for Ilara. Ilara felt the siege just as keenly. Anonymous packages would arrive at the diner for her, containing items from her old life. A diamond bracelet she'd left behind, a photograph of her and Marcus at a charity gala, a single perfect rose with a card that read, "Remember who you are." Each delivery was a cold finger tracing her spine, a reminder that he was always watching. The most chilling encounter happened one evening when she was closing up the diner. Sadie had already left, and Ilara was locking the front door when his voice came from the shadows of the alley. "Ilara." She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Marcus stepped into the dim glow of the street lamp. He looked immaculate, his expensive suit uncreased, his shoes gleaming. He seemed to suck all the warmth from the cool night air. "What do you want, Marcus?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "I want you to stop this foolishness," he said, taking a step closer. "This isn't you, living in this backwater town, slinging hash for truckers. You're Ilara Vance. You were meant for more than this." "I've never been happier," she said, clutching her keys so tightly they dug into her palm. He laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of any humor. "Happy? You're playing house with a farmhand, a man who smells of dirt and manure. Do you really think he can give you what I can?" "The world, Ilara. I offered you the world." "You offered me a cage, Marcus. A beautiful, expensive cage." His smile vanished. He closed the remaining distance between them, his presence overwhelming. He didn't touch her, but she felt pinned by the sheer force of his will. "He can't protect you," Marcus hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "He's nothing. A speck of dust on a map. I can crush him. I can take his precious land, ruin his name, leave him with nothing. And I will, unless you come back to where you belong." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her resolve, but it was followed by a surge of protective fury for the good, decent man he was threatening. "You stay away from him," she warned, her voice trembling with rage. "You stay away from us." He studied her face for a long moment, his eyes like chips of ice. "I made you a promise, Ilara," he said softly. "I told you we'd see. I always keep my promises." He then turned and melted back into the shadows, leaving her shaking under the lonely street lamp, the threat hanging in the air like poison. When she got back to the ranch, Caleb was waiting on the porch. He took one look at her pale face, and the story tumbled out of her. He listened without interruption, his expression becoming a mask of stone. When she finished, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell her not to worry. He just held her for a long time, and then he said, Let him come. It wasn't a boast, it was a statement of fact. A line drawn in the dust. He would not be broken, he would not be moved, and he would protect what was his. The wedding was in 3 days, and they both knew, without saying it, that it would be the battleground. The morning of the wedding dawned with an almost celestial beauty. A soft, pearlescent light spilled over the peaks of the Absarokas, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of dew-kissed sagebrush and the promise of a perfect autumn day. It felt as if the world itself was holding its breath, offering up its finest face for their union. Inside the small ranch house, the atmosphere was a whirlwind of gentle chaos. Sadie, a blur of nervous energy, helped Ilara with her dress. A simple, elegant gown with delicate lace sleeves that seemed to capture the very essence of her newfound freedom. Ilara's mother, who had flown in from the city, watched with a mixture of pride and a lingering, unspoken worry. She had never approved of Marcus, not truly, but she understood the power his family wielded. Her quiet presence was a testament to her love for her daughter, a silent choice to stand by her side, no matter the consequences. Ilara sat before a small vanity, looking at her reflection. The woman staring back was someone she barely recognized from a year ago. The haunted, cautious look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a clear, steady light. Her skin, once city pale, now had a healthy glow from the Montana sun. She was no longer a fragile piece of porcelain. She was stronger, more resilient, like a wildflower that had learned to thrive in rugged terrain. Caleb, meanwhile, was in the barn. The same place they would hold the reception later. He stood with his father and his brother, all three of them awkward and magnificent in their suits. His father, a man whose face was a roadmap of a life lived outdoors, clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder. "She's a good woman, son. You hold on to her." "I plan to," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. He adjusted his tie, his fingers feeling clumsy and foreign. He was more comfortable with a bridle than a silk knot. His gaze drifted around the barn. They had spent weeks cleaning it out, stringing it with fairy lights that now twinkled like captive stars in the dim interior. Tables were draped in white linen, adorned with simple jars of wildflowers Ilara and Sadie had picked the day before. It was simple, it was theirs, and it was perfect. Just before the ceremony was due to begin, Caleb sought out Ilara. He found her standing on the back porch, looking out at the pasture where their friends and family were gathering. She turned as he approached, and the sight of her stole the air from his lungs. "You're not supposed to see me before," she whispered, a smile playing on her lips. "Couldn't wait," he said, his voice a low rumble. He stepped forward, taking her hands in his. They were cold. He squeezed them gently. "You okay?" She nodded, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of the anxiety that had been her shadow for weeks. "I am now." "Ilara," he said, his gaze intense, searching hers. "No matter what happens today, nothing and nobody is going to take this from us. You hear me?" "I hear you," she said, her voice catching. He leaned in and kissed her forehead, a tender, reverent gesture that spoke more than words ever could. It was a promise of protection, a vow of devotion, a seal upon their love. In that moment, standing on the porch of the home they would share, the threat of Marcus Thorne seemed to fade, becoming a distant, powerless echo. The love between them was a fortress, strong and unbreachable. She watched him walk down the steps and take his place at the altar. The guitarist began to play. Sadie gave her a reassuring nod, her father offered his arm, and Ilara started her walk into the rest of her life. The sun was warm on her face, the faces of her loved ones beamed at her, and at the end of the aisle, the only man she had ever truly loved was waiting. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound and overwhelming joy. The storm had passed. She was safe. She was home. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. The local justice of the peace, a kind-faced woman named Mary, spoke of love being like the mountains, strong, enduring, a landmark to guide you home. Caleb and Ilara exchanged vows they had written themselves, their voices clear and steady, their promises echoing across the quiet pasture. When Caleb slid the simple gold band onto her finger, a collective happy sigh went through the crowd. "By the power vested in me by the state of Montana," Mary declared with a wide smile, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." "Caleb, you may kiss your bride." Caleb cupped Ilara's face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. He looked into her eyes, and in that moment, the rest of the world ceased to exist. There was only the two of them, a universe of shared hope and love. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was both a celebration and a prayer of thanks. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, the joyful sound rolling across the open land. It was in that perfect, crystalline moment of happiness that the serpent entered their Eden. A low, powerful rumble cut through the celebration. Heads turned towards the long gravel driveway leading to the ranch. A gleaming black sports car, the same one that had stalked the streets of Redemption Creek, was speeding towards them, kicking up a plume of dust like a malevolent spirit. It screeched to a halt just yards from the assembled guests, its engine growling like a caged beast. The driver's side door opened and Marcus Thorne emerged. He was dressed in a flawlessly tailored black suit. A stark, predatory figure against the rustic charm of the wedding. He moved with an unhurried, arrogant grace, his eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, fixed on Ilara. The joyful chatter died instantly, replaced by a thick, anxious silence. Sheriff Brody, who was a guest at the wedding, took a step forward, his hand instinctively moving towards his hip. "Marcus," he said, his voice a low warning, "you're not welcome here." Marcus ignored him completely. He took off his sunglasses, revealing eyes that glittered with a chilling mixture of fury and amusement. He began to applaud slowly, a mocking, rhythmic clap that grated on everyone's nerves. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying easily in the stillness. "A wedding? How quaint. Did you really think you could just run away and play house, Ilara? Did you think I would just let you go?" Caleb moved to stand slightly in front of Ilara, a human shield. "Get off my property, Thorne," he said, his voice dangerously calm. Marcus laughed, a sound that held no warmth. "Your property? This dusty patch of nothing? Don't make me laugh. I could buy and sell this entire valley without noticing the change in my bank account. You have nothing. You are nothing." He took another step, his eyes locked on Ilara. "I came to give the bride a wedding gift," he sneered, "a reminder of what she's throwing away." His gaze swept over the crowd, over the simple decorations, the hay bale seats. "This is a joke. You belong in mansions, Ilara, not barns. You belong on my arm, wearing diamonds, not homespun lace." "I belong with my husband," Ilara said, her voice shaking but firm. The word husband seemed to detonate something inside Marcus. The mask of amused contempt dropped, revealing the raw, ugly rage beneath, his face contorted. "Husband?" he spat, the word like venom. "That word means nothing. You are mine. You have always been mine." In a flash of terrifying speed, he lunged forward. He shoved past Caleb, who was caught for a split second by the sheer audacity of the move. Before anyone could react, Marcus's hand shot out. He didn't grab her arm, he didn't grab her waist. He fisted his hand in her long, beautiful hair, yanking her head back with a brutal, vicious tug. Ilara cried out, a sharp sound of pain and shock. The crowd gasped as one. Her veil tore and she stumbled, held up only by the cruel grip in her hair. Marcus's face was inches from hers, his expression a mask of triumphant cruelty. "You see?" he snarled, his voice a low growl for all to hear. "I can take what I want, whenever I want." Time seemed to slow down. For Caleb, the world narrowed to a single point. Marcus's hand tangled in his wife's hair, the look of pain and terror on her face, the cheerful sounds of the wedding, the blue sky, the concerned faces of his friends. It all vanished. A primal, cold fury, deeper and more potent than anything he had ever known, surged through him. It was the protective rage of a grizzly bear defending its mate, absolute and terrifying. He didn't shout, he didn't charge. He moved with a lethal, silent grace. One long stride closed the distance. His left hand shot out and clamped around Marcus's throat. It wasn't a push or a shove. It was a vice. Caleb's fingers, forged into steel by years of hard labor, dug into the soft flesh and tendons of Marcus's neck. Marcus's eyes widened in shock, then bulged in panic. A strangled, gurgling sound escaped his lips. His hand flew from Ilara's hair to claw uselessly at Caleb's wrist. But Caleb's grip was immovable, an extension of the unyielding Montana earth itself. Then, with a guttural roar that seemed to be torn from the very depths of his soul, Caleb straightened his arm. He lifted. Marcus Thorne, the powerful, untouchable man of wealth and influence, was hoisted clean off the ground. His expensive Italian shoes dangled inches above the dust, kicking spasmodically. His face, once handsome and arrogant, turned a mottled, terrifying shade of purple. He was a puppet, his strings held by a force of nature he had foolishly provoked. The silence was absolute, broken only by Marcus's choked gasps for air. Caleb held him there, suspended between heaven and earth, his eyes blazing with a righteous fire that promised utter annihilation. In that moment, he was not just a rancher. He was judge, jury, and executioner, and he was about to deliver his sentence. The tableau held for a heart-stopping eternity. The wedding guests were frozen, a gallery of shocked and horrified statues. Elara, free from Marcus's grasp, stared with wide, tear-filled eyes, her hands pressed to her mouth. She was watching the gentle, quiet man she loved transform into something fearsome and primal, all in her defense. It was Sheriff Brody who broke the spell. "Caleb, let him go," he yelled, his voice cracking through the tension like a gunshot. He drew his service weapon, holding it pointed at the ground, a clear sign he didn't want to use it but would if he had to. "Son, put him down now. Don't throw your life away for this piece of trash." The sheriff's words seemed to penetrate the red haze of Caleb's fury. His gaze flickered from Marcus's purpling, desperate face to the sheriff, then to Elara. He saw the fear in her eyes, not fear of him, but fear for him. He saw the ruin of their perfect day, the joy curdled into terror. With a final contemptuous grunt, he opened his hand. Marcus dropped to the ground in a heap, landing with a dull thud in the dust he so despised. He lay there, gasping and sputtering, clawing at his throat, his elegant suit now covered in dirt. He coughed violently, dragging precious air back into his lungs, the sounds wet and ragged. Caleb didn't spare him a second glance. He turned immediately to Elara, his rage vanishing as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a deep, aching concern. He gently touched her cheek, his eyes scanning her for any injury. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough. She couldn't speak. She just nodded, collapsing into his arms, burying her face in his chest as the sobs she'd been holding back finally broke free. He held her tightly, stroking her hair, murmuring words of comfort, his body a solid, protective wall around her. Sheriff Brody holstered his weapon and strode over to Marcus, who was now pushing himself up onto his hands and knees. Two of Brody's deputies, who had also been guests, moved in to flank him. "Marcus Thorne," Brody said, his voice hard as iron. "You're under arrest for trespassing, disorderly conduct, and assault." Marcus looked up, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. A dark, ugly bruise was already forming on his neck, a handprint of raw power. "Assault," he rasped, his voice a shredded whisper. "Did you see what he did to me? He tried to kill me. You should be arresting him." "I saw what I saw," Brody said flatly. "I saw you drive onto private property, disrupt a lawful ceremony, and physically assault Mrs. Blackwood." He let the new name hang in the air, a final definitive statement. "You laid your hands on the bride first. In my book, everything that happened after that was self-defense. Now get on your feet. You can tell your story to a judge." As the deputies hauled a protesting Marcus to his feet and cuffed him, the reality of the situation began to settle over the assembled crowd. The wedding was over. The beautiful, hopeful ceremony had been irrevocably shattered. The fairy lights in the barn now seemed to mock them, their cheerful twinkle out of place in the heavy, somber atmosphere. Guests began to murmur amongst themselves, their faces a mixture of pity for the couple and shock at the raw violence they had witnessed. Sadie rushed to Elara's side, wrapping a comforting arm around her. Elara's mother stood nearby, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly together. Caleb's father walked over and placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a silent gesture of support. But Caleb knew this was far from over. Marcus Thorne was not the kind of man to accept public humiliation and defeat. He had money, connections, and an army of lawyers who could twist reality into any shape he desired. Sheriff Brody might see it as self-defense. But a city prosecutor, swayed by the Thorne family's influence, would see it differently. They would see the photo of a wealthy man being lifted off the ground by his throat by a common rancher. He looked down at his hand, the one that had held Marcus's life in its grip. He could still feel the frantic pulse, the delicate bones of the man's larynx. He had come so close to crossing a line from which there was no return. The thought sent a cold shiver through him, a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling afternoon air. The deputies shoved a still ranting Marcus into the back of a squad car. As the car pulled away, kicking up another cloud of dust, Marcus's eyes met Caleb's through the rear window. They were filled with a black venomous hatred, and they held a clear, unmistakable promise. This has just begun. The fight had moved from the open pasture to a new, far more dangerous battlefield of courtrooms and lawyers, and Caleb knew, with a sinking certainty, that the storm had not passed. It was just gathering strength. The days that followed were a blur of muted colors and hushed conversations. The joyous wedding feast lay untouched in the barn, a sad testament to a celebration that never was. Friends and family helped clean up, their movements slow and somber, their words of comfort feeling hollow in the oppressive silence that had descended upon the Blackwood ranch. The beautiful wedding dress, its veil torn, hung in the closet like a ghost. Ilara moved through the house as if in a trance. The physical pain from Marcus's assault was minimal, a tender scalp, a slight ache in her neck. But the psychological wounds were deep. Sleep offered little respite, her dreams filled with the image of Marcus's face contorted in rage, his hand tangled in her hair. She would wake with a gasp, her heart pounding, reaching for Caleb in the dark, needing the reassurance of his solid presence beside her. She felt a profound and suffocating guilt. This was her past, her monster, and it had risen up to destroy their happiest day and threaten the future of the man she loved. Caleb was her rock, but she could see the toll it was taking on him too. He was quieter than ever, his silences deeper, more troubled. He spent his days working on the ranch with a feverish intensity, mending fences that didn't need mending, chopping wood that was already stacked high for the winter. It was as if he was trying to physically exhaust the turmoil raging inside him. At night, he would sit on the porch for hours, staring out at the dark mountains, his hands resting on his knees. She knew he was replaying those few violent seconds over and over in his mind, wrestling with the man he had become in that moment. Their fears were realized less than a week later. A sleek sedan, different from Marcus's but just as menacing, rolled up the driveway. A man in a crisp suit stepped out, a courier delivering a thick envelope. It contained exactly what they had dreaded, a summons. Marcus Thorne, with his team of high-priced lawyers, was not only contesting his own charges, but was also pressing charges against Caleb. Attempted murder. The words on the page were absurd, a grotesque distortion of what had happened. But in the cold black-and-white language of the law, they were terrifyingly real. Marcus's lawyers had crafted a narrative of an unprovoked, savage attack. They painted Caleb as a jealous, unstable brute, and Marcus as the victim, a concerned ex-fiancé who had merely come to express his well wishes. They had photos of the bruises on Marcus's neck, doctors' reports detailing laryngeal trauma and risk of asphyxiation. They were building a case designed to send Caleb to prison. The news spread through Redemption Creek like a grass fire. The town was divided. Most who had been at the wedding stood firmly with Caleb and Ilara. They had seen Marcus's aggression, his vile provocation, but Marcus's influence reached even here. He had business dealings in the county, investments that provided jobs. Whispers started to circulate. Maybe the rancher had overreacted. Maybe he did have a temper. Marcus Thorne was an important man. You didn't just attack people like that and expect to get away with it. The seeds of doubt, carefully planted and fertilized by Marcus's money, began to sprout. Sheriff Brody was furious but hamstrung. "My report is clear," he told Caleb, sitting at their kitchen table, his hat in his hands. "I stated that Thorne was the primary aggressor. But the county DA is getting pressure from up high. Thorne's family has friends in the state capital. They're trying to take this out of my hands, paint our whole department as a bunch of backwoods hicks protecting one of our own." Their lawyer, a kind older man named Ben Carter, who had handled the Blackwood family's affairs for 40 years, was grim. "They're going to try to bury us in motions and legal fees," Ben explained, his brow furrowed. "They'll try to bankrupt you before you ever see a courtroom. Their strategy is to make this so painful, so expensive, that you'll be forced to take a plea deal." That night, Ilara found Caleb in the barn, standing by the stall of his oldest, most trusted horse, a gentle giant named Atlas. He was leaning against the stall door, his head bowed. "This is my fault," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I brought him here. I brought this darkness into your life." Caleb turned, his face etched with exhaustion in the dim light. He stepped forward and pulled her into a fierce embrace. "No," he said, his voice a low, ragged command. "Don't you ever say that. The only thing you brought into my life is light. This isn't on you, this is on him. This is about a bully who can't stand that he lost." He pulled back, holding her by the shoulders, his eyes boring into hers. "We're not going to break, Ilara. I'm not going to let him win." But as he held her, a cold fear gripped him. Marcus wasn't just trying to put him in jail, he was trying to dismantle their life, piece by piece. He was poisoning their community against them, threatening their home, and turning their love into a source of pain and fear. And Caleb wasn't sure how to fight a war when the enemy's weapons were lies and money, and the battlefield was his own wife's heart. The investigation would be everything, and he knew Marcus would have covered his tracks, leaving them with nothing but their word against his. They needed a miracle. They needed a witness who could prove Marcus's intent, someone who could cut through the web of lies he was so expertly weaving. The miracle they needed was pouring coffee behind the counter of the Rusty Spur. Sadie had been a wreck ever since the wedding. She was fiercely loyal to Ilara and Caleb, and the injustice of the situation ate at her. She had seen Marcus's cruelty firsthand, not just at the wedding, but in the weeks prior. She had seen the way he watched the diner, the unnerving packages he had sent. But what truly haunted her was a conversation she had overheard. It was 2 nights before the wedding. Marcus had come into the diner, not alone, but with 2 other men in expensive suits. They sat in a corner booth, confident that no one in this small-town establishment was worth their notice. Sadie was their waitress. She had kept her head down, her expression neutral, but her ears were wide open. Marcus, fueled by whiskey and his own towering arrogance, had been bragging. "She thinks she can hide out here with this plowboy?" Marcus had sneered, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I'm going to give her a wedding present she'll never forget. I'm going to walk right into the middle of that pathetic little ceremony and remind her and everyone else who she belongs to." One of his friends had chuckled nervously. "Isn't that a little extreme, Marcus? Maybe you should just let it go." Marcus had slammed his glass down on the table, the sound making Sadie jump. "Let it go," he'd hissed, his voice low and venomous. "She humiliated me. She is a Thorn asset. You don't just walk away from a deal. I'm going to drag her out of there by her hair if I have to. I'll make a scene so spectacular, so humiliating for that dirt kicker she's with, that he'll be a laughingstock. No one will ever look at him the same way again. And she'll come crawling back." The words had chilled Sadie to the bone. At the time she'd dismissed it as drunken bluster, the vile ranting of a jilted egomaniac. But after what happened at the wedding, the specificity of him grabbing Ilara's hair, she knew it had been a premeditated plan. He had announced his intentions. He had confessed his motive. She told Sheriff Brody what she had heard. He listened intently, making notes. "This is good, Sadie," he'd said. "This proves malice. It proves his intent to assault her. Would you be willing to testify to this in court?" Sadie's heart hammered in her chest. "Of course," she said, her voice more confident than she felt. But Marcus was not a man to leave loose ends. The day after she spoke to the sheriff, a man she'd never seen before came into the diner. He didn't order anything. He just sat at the counter, nursing a glass of water and staring at her. An hour later, as she was walking to her car after her shift, a dark sedan pulled up alongside her. The window rolled down, and one of the men who had been with Marcus that night was in the passenger seat. "Sadie, is it?" he'd said, his voice silky smooth. "Mr. Thorne heard you spoke with the police. He's very disappointed." He feels you may have misremembered your conversation." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. Memories can be tricky things. Sometimes, under stress, people forget what's important, like their job or their family's safety. It would be a shame if something unfortunate were to happen. Think about it. The car then sped off, leaving Sadie standing in the dusty parking lot, her blood running cold. The threat was clear and terrifyingly effective. Sadie had an aging mother she cared for in the next town over. She had a life, a job. She was just a waitress, not a hero. The fear was a physical thing, a knot of ice in her stomach. What could she possibly do against a man like Marcus Thorne? She tried to keep it to herself, not wanting to add to Elara and Caleb's burdens. But they could see the change in her. She was jumpy, distracted, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a haunted, worried look. Finally, Elara confronted her. "Sadie, what is it? You're not yourself." The dam of Sadie's fear broke. The whole story came pouring out. The conversation she'd overheard, the visit from the sheriff, the veiled threats from Marcus's men. "I'm so sorry, Elara," she sobbed. "I want to help. I swear I do. But I'm scared. They know where my mum lives. What if they do something?" Elara hugged her friend tightly, her own fear momentarily forgotten in a wave of protective anger for Sadie. "You will not put yourself in danger for us," she said fiercely. "We'll figure something else out." But they all knew there was nothing else. Sadie's testimony was their only real weapon. That evening, Caleb drove into town and went to see Sadie. He found her sitting on her small front porch, wrapped in a blanket against the evening chill. He didn't pressure her. He didn't ask her to be brave. He just sat on the step below her. "Sadie," he said, his voice quiet, "I would never ask you to risk yourself or your mother for me. If you walk away from this, I will understand. Elara and I will both understand." He looked up at her, his face honest and weary. "But I need you to know what's at stake. This isn't just about me staying out of jail. It's about him. If he gets away with this, he will never stop. He will see it as proof that he can do whatever he wants to anyone, without consequence. He'll keep coming after Elara. He'll keep trying to destroy what we have. Your testimony. It's the only thing that proves he's a liar. It's the only thing that can stop him for good." He stood up. "Whatever you decide, we're grateful for your friendship. That's all that matters." He turned and walked back to his truck, leaving her alone with her conscience and her fear. Sadie sat there for a long time, watching the stars begin to appear in the vast Montana sky. She thought about the kindness Elara had shown her since she arrived in town. She thought about the quiet strength of Caleb, a good man being torn apart by a monster. She thought about the ugly, sneering face of Marcus Thorne in the diner, so confident in his power, so certain that people like her didn't matter. Her fear was still there, a cold, hard knot inside her. But something else was there now too. A slow-burning anger, a spark of defiance. Marcus Thorne thought he could bully and threaten his way to victory. He thought she was just a nobody, a waitress he could easily intimidate. He was about to find out how wrong he was. She went inside, picked up the phone, and called Sheriff Brody. "Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and steady, "it's Sadie. I need to add something to my statement. There's something I forgot to tell you. When Marcus Thorne was in my diner, he wasn't just talking. My phone, it was on the counter, recording. I was trying to get a voice memo for a new recipe. I have every single word he said. It was a lie, a huge, monumental, life-altering lie. There was no recording. But as she spoke the words, a plan began to form in her mind, a desperate, dangerous gamble that was their last and only hope. Sadie's bluff was an act of pure, unadulterated desperation. When she hung up the phone with Sheriff Brody, her hands were shaking so badly she had to sit down. The lie had felt heavy and dangerous in her mouth, but it was the only weapon she could imagine that might be powerful enough to fight a man like Marcus Thorne. Sheriff Brody, a man who had seen his fair share of liars, sensed something in her voice. He drove to her house immediately. "Sadie," he said, sitting across from her at her small kitchen table, "you tell me the truth. Is there a recording?" Her resolve crumbled under his steady, knowing gaze. "No," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I panicked. I thought if he believed there was proof, real proof, he might back off." Brody leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his tired face. He was silent for a long moment. He should have been angry. She was proposing to obstruct justice, to fabricate evidence, but he also understood the fear that had driven her to it. He had seen what the Thorne family's lawyers were doing, the way they were twisting the truth and smearing a good man's name. "It's a dangerous game you're playing," he said finally, his voice low. "If he calls your bluff, you could be in a world of trouble." "I know," she said, "but what else can we do? My word against his isn't enough. They'll tear me apart on the stand. They'll say I'm just a small-town waitress with a crush on Caleb, or that Ilara put me up to it. But a recording, people believe what they can hear with their own ears." An idea, audacious and risky, began to form in the sheriff's mind. It was unorthodox. It skirted the edges of legality. But Marcus Thorne wasn't playing by the rules, so maybe it was time they stopped too. "All right," Brody said, leaning forward. "Here's what we're going to do. We are going to make that recording real." The plan was simple in its concept and terrifying in its execution. Sadie would agree to meet with one of Marcus's men, the same one who had threatened her in the parking lot. She would tell him she was having second thoughts about her testimony and was willing to reconsider for the right price. She would be wearing a wire supplied by the sheriff's department. Their goal was to get the man to either admit to the threats or, even better, to repeat the story of what Marcus had said in the diner, confirming Sadie's original statement. The risk was enormous. If they suspected a trap, Sadie would be in incredible danger. But she agreed without hesitation. The spark of defiance in her had grown into a steady flame. They set the meeting for the following night at a deserted truck stop 20 miles out of town. The place was little more than a gravel lot and a closed-down diner, offering both isolation and a plausible reason for a late-night rendezvous. Sheriff Brody and two of his best deputies would be hidden nearby, listening to every word, ready to move in at a moment's notice. The next evening, as Sadie drove towards the meeting point, her heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of her chest. The small recording device taped to her skin felt as heavy as a block of concrete. She kept repeating Caleb's words in her mind. If he gets away with this, he will never stop. The dark sedan was already there when she arrived, parked under the flickering, unreliable glow of a single sodium lamp. The man from the parking lot, whose name she'd learned was Julian, got out and approached her car. He gestured for her to get out. "Let's talk out here," he said, his eyes scanning the darkness. "I'd rather stay in the car," she said, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "Get out," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. She complied, her legs feeling like jelly. He led her to the front of his car, keeping her in the open. "So," he said, crossing his arms, "you've come to your senses." "I have a mother to think about," Sadie said, sticking to the script Brody had helped her create. "My memory, it's not so good anymore. But my silence isn't free." Julian smirked. "I didn't think it would be." "How much?" $50,000, she said, the number feeling absurdly large. He laughed. "You've got a high opinion of yourself, but fine. Mr. Thorne is generous with those who are loyal. You give a new statement to the police saying you misheard everything, and the money is yours." This was it, the moment of truth. "I'll do it," Sadie said, "but I need some insurance. I need to know you'll hold up your end. Just tell me again what the story is supposed to be. What did I mishear?" Julian's eyes narrowed. He was suspicious. "You know what you heard. Mr. Thorne was upset. He was venting about a business deal gone bad. Nothing to do with the girl." "No, that's not good enough," Sadie pushed, her heart pounding. "He was talking about the wedding, about what he was going to do, about grabbing her hair. I remember that part clearly. Your boss needs my story to match his. So tell me what he said, so I can get it right." Julian took a step closer, his face hardening. "You're getting awful bold for a coffee slinger. Maybe you don't need money. Maybe you need a more permanent reminder of how to be quiet." He reached into his jacket. In the surveillance van, Sheriff Brody's voice was tense. "He's going for a weapon. Move in, now." But before the deputies could burst from their hiding spots, another sound split the night. It was the roar of an engine, the squeal of tires on gravel. Headlights flooded the scene, blinding Julian. Caleb's old battered pickup truck slid to a stop, pinning Julian in the beams, cutting off his escape. Caleb vaulted out of the driver's side, his face a mask of cold fury. He had followed Sadie. He couldn't let her face this danger alone. He had promised Brody he would stay back, but seeing her drive off into the darkness, he couldn't do it. "Get away from her," Caleb growled, his hands clenched into fists. Julian, momentarily stunned, recovered quickly. He pulled a small, wicked-looking knife from his jacket. "You just don't learn, do you, farm boy?" he snarled. But before he could take a step, the night erupted in shouts. "Sheriff's Department, drop the weapon, get on the ground." Brody and his deputies swarmed the scene, guns drawn. Julian, caught between Caleb's rage and the drawn weapons of the police, wisely dropped the knife and raised his hands. As the deputies cuffed Julian, Brody stormed over to Caleb. "What in the hell do you think you're doing? You could have gotten her killed. You could have ruined the entire operation." "She's my friend," Caleb said simply, his eyes on Sadie, who was leaning against her car, shaking but safe. "I wasn't going to let her do it alone." Sadie looked from Caleb to the sheriff and then at the cuffed man being put into a squad car. They hadn't gotten the full confession on tape. The plan had gone sideways. But they had gotten something else. They had gotten Julian on tape, with a weapon threatening a witness. It was witness tampering, intimidation, and assault with a deadly weapon. It was a thread, and Sheriff Brody knew that if he pulled on it hard enough, Marcus Thorne's entire web of lies would unravel. The arrest of Julian was the turning point. Faced with a slew of serious charges and the undeniable evidence on Sadie's wire, he cracked. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he gave a full confession, detailing not only the plan to intimidate Sadie, but also corroborating every word she had said about Marcus's premeditated plot to assault Ilara at the wedding. He laid it all out. The money, the threats, the cold, calculated cruelty of his boss. The dam had broken. The county district attorney, who had been bending to the political pressure from the Thorne family, could no longer ignore the mountain of evidence. The fabricated narrative of Marcus as the victim crumbled to dust. The charges of attempted murder against Caleb were dropped so fast, it was almost comical. In their place, a new set of indictments was issued for Marcus Thorne: assault, conspiracy, witness tampering, and perjury. The news hit Redemption Creek with the force of a thunderclap. The whispers of doubt about Caleb died overnight, replaced by a groundswell of support and a renewed sense of community outrage against the wealthy outsider who thought he could buy and corrupt their town. Marcus Thorne, the untouchable titan of industry, was suddenly a common criminal. He was released on a multi-million-dollar bail, but his power was shattered. His name, once a symbol of influence, was now synonymous with disgrace. The legal battle was far from over, but the war had been won. The threat that had loomed over Caleb and Ilara for so long finally began to recede. The oppressive weight lifted from their shoulders, and for the first time in weeks, they could breathe again. One crisp, clear evening, they stood on their porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The air was still, the world quiet, save for the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance. "It's over," Ilara said softly, leaning her head on Caleb's shoulder. "It's finally over." "Almost," Caleb replied, wrapping his arm around her. A few days later, they gathered their closest friends and family, the same small group that had witnessed the disastrous first ceremony, in the pasture behind the barn. There was no fancy dress, no rows of guests, no elaborate decorations. Ilara wore a simple white sundress, and Caleb was in his comfortable jeans and a clean shirt. With Sheriff Brody and a tearfully happy Sadie as their witnesses, they stood before Mary, the justice of the peace, once again. The sun was warm, the breeze gentle. This time, there were no interruptions, no shadows from the past. There was only the quiet sincerity of their love. They spoke their vows again, and this time, the words held a new, deeper meaning. They were not just promises for a happy future. They were a testament to the storm they had weathered together. Their love had been tested by fire, and it had not been consumed. It had been forged into something stronger, more resilient, and infinitely more precious. When Mary pronounced them husband and wife for the second time, Caleb kissed Ilara with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. It was a kiss of relief, of victory, of a love that had stared into the abyss and refused to blink. That night, they didn't have a grand reception. Instead, their small group of loved ones gathered around a bonfire in the yard. They shared stories, laughed, and toasted the newlyweds with beer from a cooler. The fairy lights in the barn twinkled, but this time they weren't a sad reminder of a ruined day. They were a beacon of hope, a symbol of a new beginning. Later, when everyone else had gone home, Caleb and Ilara sat by the dying embers of the fire, wrapped together in a single blanket. They didn't speak for a long time, content in the peaceful silence. "Thank you," Ilara whispered into the quiet, her voice thick with emotion. "For what?" he asked. "For fighting for us. For not letting him win." Caleb pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "There was never any other choice," he said. "You and me, we're not something that can be broken." He looked out at the vast, star-dusted sky, at the dark, solid shapes of the mountains that stood guard over their valley. The world was immense and sometimes dangerous, filled with men like Marcus Thorne, but here, on this land, with this woman in his arms, he was home. The dust of Redemption Creek had settled, not as a reminder of a struggle, but as the foundation of a life they had fought for and won together.